Hi, I'm Len Epp from Lean Pub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Phillip Compeau. Based in Pittsburgh, Phillip is Assistant Department Head and Associate Teaching Professor in the Computational Biology Department at Carnegie Mellon University. In addition to his academic and administrative work, Phillip is a passionate supporter of a variety of online and offline educational initiatives. For example, he co-founded the computational biology learning platform Rosalind, and he helped lead the development of the first computational biology MOOC, or massively open online course, on Coursera, all the way back in 2013. You can follow Phillip on Twitter at Phillip Compeau and check out his website at compeau.cbd.cmu.edu. Phillip is the author of the book Biological Modeling, A Short Tour. In the book, Phillip introduces the reader to what biological modeling is through fascinating examples like how zebras get their stripes and how algorithms can be trained to see biological cells. In this interview, we're going to talk about Phillip's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience writing and publishing courses. So thank you very much, Phillip, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you, Len. Great to be here.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found your way into studying mathematics and a career in computational biology.
So I grew up in a small town of about 2,500 to 3,000 in North Carolina, in the foothills of the mountains, and went through public school system there and had some really great teachers and some interesting teachers as well. I'll leave it at that. I think we could fill an entire hour probably with some stories, that some of which are horrifying from that experience, but I also had some fantastic teachers along the way and some people who really fostered a love of mathematics and an ability in mathematics. So I was able to get connected to problem solving competitions and things like that. So I had a sense that I wanted to be a college professor even before I went to study in undergrad. And, fortunately, I think I picked an undergrad institution where that desire made a lot of sense. So I went to Davidson College in North Carolina, in part because I could play tennis in college. It was going to be difficult. It was a dream of mine, really, to play competitive tennis at a Division I school. And I wanted to go somewhere where that was possible, but that also had really good academics. And so I wound up at Davidson. And Davidson, most people know it because that's where Steph Curry went to school, but it's also the top liberal arts college in the South. And it also has Division I athletics. So about a quarter of the student body is a Division I athlete because it's a small, 1,700, 1,800 student enrollment type place. So it fit what I wanted to do, as well as being close to home. And that's where I did my undergraduate studies. I majored in mathematics there and got to play tennis and make some close bonds with lifelong friends in that way. And it didn't knock me off wanting to be a professor, because I had some absolutely fantastic professors across whatever subject I was studying, not just in mathematics, but across the liberal arts spectrum. And I think it gave me a sense of what a professor is, that now that I'm at a large research institution, was not reflective of exactly how all professors are or what they care about, because I was at a place where teaching was sort of at the forefront, and you didn't have graduate students. And there was a high premium placed on being well-rounded. So even though I knew I wanted to be a professor, having that experience made me want to be a professor who focuses on teaching. And I spent a year after that at Cambridge University. I got a scholarship through Davidson, actually, to have a full scholarship to study mathematics at Cambridge and to complete what's called Part 3 of the mathematical tripos. So undergraduates at Cambridge there have a very grueling curriculum that they go through, and then they're allowed to continue on and do an additional year of study if they like, and then they open that additional year of study to international students as well. So it was an extremely international mix of people that I found myself with, 150 or so, I think, maybe a bit more, all of whom were like very intent on studying mathematics at a place where you could take these courses that were unbelievably rigorous. And I think that I would add that it reinforced my desire to be a teacher as much as my experience in undergrad had, in a different way, because a lot of the teaching was really bad. Some of it was good. But I felt like the material was unbelievably advanced, but I essentially taught myself a huge amount of the material and scraped by on the final exams and so on. And I thought, well, this is, in a different sense, making me want to be somebody who focuses on teaching undergrads for a living. I knew I needed a PhD to do that. I'd had a little bit of research experience in mathematics through my undergrad experience, but I wasn't inspired by doing mathematics research in the way that I think other graduate students in mathematics are. And so that was a difficulty, because I knew where point B was. I knew I wanted to be a professor and focus on teaching, but getting there was somewhat of a struggle, in the sense that you really need to care very deeply about studying a single research project for a period of 5+ years. It may be a lot more. In some cases, people take 10, 11+ years to do a PhD. That's a huge part of one's life. And you're working in a field, in an area where, to get a PhD in mathematics, you need really probably only a couple of publications. And those publications, those research papers, may get cited, if you're lucky, a couple dozen times. So it's not a place you're going to obtain any sort of fame. And you're going to be working on a problem where you are working on something that a tiny community of people around the world has any real understanding of. There are a lot of mathematicians maybe who could understand it, but in terms of when you actually sit down and reach the frontier of mathematics research, it can be a pretty lonely place. And I found that out firsthand in a PhD that I completed at UC San Diego. I would say that I went out there and didn't have a full picture of this. I was just set on point B. And I was fortunate that I happened to select an academic advisor, a PhD advisor, who happened to have funding from Howard Hughes Medical Institute to work on education projects. So Pavel Pesner was my PhD advisor, and he, in the field of computational biology, is someone that sort of everyone knows. He has worked on fundamental problems in how we take biological data and build algorithms to analyze it for decades, notably in the area of assembling genomes. So if we want to read out what is the human genome, this ultimately boils down to, you have a bunch of fragments of DNA from multiple cells that all have the same DNA. And then you want to overlap fragments of DNA, since they came from the same initial source, to produce what the underlying genome is. And that is a computational problem, because you may have hundreds of millions of fragments. You can't do it manually. And he has worked in this area and a few other areas, and has really made a name for himself in terms of research. But he also cares about teaching, and happened to have education funding that I didn't know about when I approached him to be a PhD advisor. So things were a little bit serendipitous there. And he says that he was taken aback when he asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, I want to be somebody who's like an undergrad liberal arts professor, and focus full-time, or as much of my time as possible, on teaching, because he'd never had anybody tell him that before. It's a strange thing to tell to somebody who may have millions of dollars of research funding and is at the forefront of their field, that you want to be a teacher for a living. But fortunately, I found the right person there. And this sort of led to me having passion projects that fortunately became part of what my PhD thesis was. I did a fine PhD thesis that got its citations, and that I look back upon fondly, but I also at the same time had a chance to work on increasingly scalable online education projects with Pavel that allowed me to have a little bit of a reputation for working in this area. And in addition to, doing things like being an instructor in a pre-calculus course or TAing a bunch of calc courses, which are required of math students in order to get paid as a PhD student, to have this sort of portfolio, so to speak, of online education experiences helped me out, I think, a lot when it came time to apply to be a professor. And I found a position at Carnegie Mellon that would be in computational biology that was focused on teaching. So even though Carnegie Mellon is an R1 large research institution, they have a track for people who want to focus on teaching and administration. A lot of universities have this sort of role. And I believe that was the only position in the world that would be within the field of computational biology focused on teaching specifically. And so that was another kind of point of fortune where in 2015, I started my position at Carnegie Mellon on the teaching track. And that's where I've been since then.
Thanks very much for sharing that. You captured sort of the sort of nuances of every step, I thought, very well there, including this, the particular challenges of a PhD or the tripos at Cambridge and things like that. You said a couple of very interesting things at the beginning there. Given your interest that you developed over time in teaching and things like that, which was you said horrible teachers or horrible experiences with teachers, and you also mentioned getting into problem solving. And I wanted to ask you if you're willing to talk about it. I mean, because this has actually come up in discussions on the podcast before, particularly because a lot of LeanPub authors are people out there trying to write, teach people things and show people how to do things. And sometimes it's because they're emulating all the positive, great experiences they had in their life. And sometimes there's a reactionary element to it as well. And I wouldn't describe my own experiences as horrible, but I had some bad ones myself that, when at an early age, sort of realizing that, teachers aren't necessarily heroes. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind maybe talking, not necessarily the details unless you want to, but just sharing generally what those horrible experiences were.
Well, the darker ones would be people who wound up spending time in prison for horrific crimes.
Okay.
So I wouldn't get into those, but the example I always give is that I had a high school biology class that I hated so much that I vowed I would never study biology again after that course. And I often will start a talk to students about what computational biology is with the question, who here hated their biology class in high school? And it's about 85 to 90%. And often these are talks that we give as prospective student talks for students who have been admitted or who are applying to Carnegie Mellon who want to come to study undergrad there. And I have noticed it's almost exclusively with their parents, that all the parents hated biology. And fortunately, not all of the students hated biology, although most did. And so maybe we're headed in the right direction there. I find some hope that fewer people hated it. There were a lot of issues, but largely it was a subject that seemed unbelievably based off of memorization, filling out. We just filled out a bunch of worksheets and memorized a lot of facts that I don't think I could tell you one of them. We had we did like the standard dissection. There was no, I think we had a fetal pig and a frog, and there was no guidance given on what we were even supposed to do or what we were looking at. It was that poorly sort of organized. And so I thought, I'm just surprised that anyone would be a biologist if this is truly what it was. And I had no context of the beauty of biology. And I had no idea that while I was doing this class, that we were just filling out hundreds of pages of worksheets and memorizing things so that we could do well on an end of course test, state-sponsored test. Meanwhile, there was this revolution happening in biology, where biology was going from sort of an experimental field to one where questions are answered by analyzing data. And I think it's a cool life lesson in terms of don't promise that you're never going to do something again, because it might come back and bite you. And in my case, it's like, what I do with my entire life is trying to find cool ways of teaching biology, or to show biologists how things are really done in terms of computational data analysis in the field.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to asking you about questions about that, about biology and data science and the big transformation and things like that. But it's funny, the kind of parallels. I grew up in southern Saskatchewan in Canada, and your description of a terrible biology class maps quite well onto my own experience. I remember being quite angry. I mean, I never quite put it together with the lack of guidance when it came to dissecting the frog that I had to do. But that I did, there was something just wrong about what was happening, right? I was like, well, why am I doing this? What do you mean? Like, how am I supposed to know what a liver is? Like, you showed me a 2-dimensional picture from a 20-year-old textbook, and like, that's not enough guidance to do surgery. And I in particular remember really hating being graded on how well I could draw. I'm like, isn't this biology? And I mean, these are the sort of crude thoughts of someone, a sort of young teenager, but like, I could tell, like, there's, and it wasn't until later that I sort of put together in my kind of haphazard way that, oh, this might be just the kind of echo of the 19th century gentleman scientist who walked around with a notebook. And it was very important for them to be able to draw things, because, they might go on a 2-year-long journey on a sailboat. And if, when they come back from that island, they better have been able to draw things reasonably well, or there'd be no record of what they saw. But being able to do things with kind of like, test tubes and pencils and things like that, there was still some echo of that in even at the time that I would have been studying. It would have been outdated.
Yes, and I think it's not to indict all biology teachers. I think that they just have an extremely uphill climb often, because the curricula are getting better, but they're getting better at a slow rate. And often the biology teachers may have to kind of go outside of what they're asked to really teach as part of that curriculum in order to show students something that's really neat and cool. I mean, biology has been really interesting for a long time. I mean, I was amazed when I finally went back and read On the Origin of Species, and how brilliant it is, like cover to cover. Or how Mendel's experiments by modern standards probably would have been fraudulent. And you've got, when you go into the 20th century, you've got experiments to unlock, like, what is DNA? What is it made up of? You have the genetic code that takes triplets of DNA nucleotides and converts them into amino acids by this system. And those amino acids are building blocks for proteins that do everything in your cells. And these experiments to identify what is actually going on in the cell and what the identity of these molecules is that you can't see, or maybe with an electron microscope you could start to elucidate this, but you wouldn't be able to see any change. And to sort of understand that change in the cell without ever observing it, these experiments are just downright genius, and students really don't learn them for the most part. And it's this extremely strange dichotomy. I would say the only thing that I find comparable to it is mathematics, actually, because what mathematics is and how mathematics is taught in schools are so wildly different from each other. People have written about this. I wouldn't be the first to say it, but it's truly shocking.
Yeah, that actually, I think that's actually one thing I wanted to pick on that I think is pick up on that I think is related to that, is you mentioned when you were sort of younger, getting into problem solving. And that's actually a very specific term of art. And I think that a lot of people might think of that as, it's sort of kind of paradoxical to say they think that's math, or they think that's not math. But if you're coming from the wrong perspective on both sides of what math is and what problem solving is, any comparison is going to be confusing. But I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about what problem solving is. And it's something that actually attracts a lot of younger people. Maybe if the classes that they're in school maybe aren't that attractive, but they find this problem solving thing, which has this whole culture around it. And yeah, I was wondering if you could talk, and then it's related to the kind of things you're talking about when you're talking about solving these problems about what's going on inside a cell. So if you could talk a little bit about what problem solving is, particularly, let's say, for teenagers who get into it.
Yes, I think I got into it really when I was maybe in 7th grade. I had a really good teacher who got me involved into math counts, which I think is the middle school level version of that. And there's high school versions of problem solving that wind up being culminating in the US and then the International Mathematics Olympiad, where you have mathematics questions about different sorts of things, like, and then you have a timed exam where you have to answer the questions. And this is, it's a world that I think, not a lot of people are that aware of, and that you have these competitions and they're extremely challenging exams. And they'll ask questions like, there's some good examples of these sorts of questions on places like 3 Blue, 1 Brown on YouTube that have done a great job of explaining them. Here's like one example of a question would be that I saw on that channel. If you pick 4 points on the outside of a sphere, then they're going to form a tetrahedron if you connect the 4 points. A simpler example would be you have 3 points on the outside of a circle, and they form a triangle. Just connect the 3 points. So what are the chances in each of those 2 cases? You have a 3-dimensional case of the sphere and a 2-dimensional case of the circle. What's the probability that if you just chose the points randomly, that the triangle or the tetrahedron, as it were, would contain the center of the circle or the sphere? And it has a nice clear-cut answer that you can get to. That's a very challenging question for the 3D case. But that's the sort of question that you can pretty quickly explain it to someone. But the idea of getting an answer to that, and not just having an answer, but having verifiable proof of an answer, like you know that your answer is 100% correct and can justify it, almost like a legal argument. That's a different matter entirely. And that's what mathematics really is. And so, a simpler example would be like the Pythagorean theorem. Students know a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. We drill that into them. We do a good job of making sure that covers the population pretty well, even though it's not 100% clear to me, someone with a PhD in mathematics, why they need it. That's another matter. But we do manage to teach that fact. It has an explanation. Very few students learn about that explanation, and that explanation is what mathematics really is. The explanation itself can be done in a variety of ways, and it's beautiful. And if I have somebody who has a little bit of a knowledge of high school algebra, I find I can show it to them in 5 minutes or so. And that, to me, is the divide between sort of high school or middle school mathematics courses and problem solving, which is trying to get more at what mathematics really is, which is being able to not just state a fact, but to know why it's the case and to be able to justify it.
Yeah, that's a really great description of the area, and thanks for bringing up the competitions and stuff like that happen as well. You're reminding me of when I was doing my doctorate. It was in English, but I had a friend who was doing a doctorate in math, and one day he was, I saw him with a backpack, and I'm like, "Where are you going?" He goes, "Glasgow." I'm like, "Why?" He's like, "They can't get the penguins to hatch at the zoo." It was something along those lines. And we talked a lot about stuff, but like I think he did fluid dynamics or something like that. But it was that was when it sort of finally clicked for me, like what he did, right, was solve problems. And it's real, as you mentioned. There's one of the things that makes this sort of problem solving culture so attractive to some people is that there's usually not one answer. There's many ways of approaching a problem, and just because you solve it one way doesn't mean you've exhausted the interest in that problem, because you can then think of another way to solve it, and then you can often find your way into mathematical concepts yourself without knowing, sort of like understood mathematical concepts yourself without knowing that's what you're doing, and then that becomes part of your journey along the way. And including just fascinating things like you can have a terrible problem that you're having a terrible time solving, and then read a paper and it's like, oh, that's how you do it,
right? Yes, and I think about the same thing, like to the Pythagorean theorem example, and that there being multiple ways of getting at it, and that there's a couple hundred or however many different proofs of this statement. none of them still provide any real intuition about why it is that if you draw a right triangle and then you form squares from each of the three sides of the triangle, that the areas of the smaller squares, when you add those two squares areas together, would equal the area of the third. That's an extremely strange, non-intuitive fact. And that's what the Pythagorean theorem is, right? And so often you'll have justifications in mathematics that make the theorem, what it is you're trying to prove, make sense. Like, oh, I kind of get that. That's intuitive and obvious now. And even though you can justify why this has to be the case, it doesn't provide any intuition on why, if there were some higher power dictating why these things have to be true, why in the world would this be true? So I think that's a good example too of sometimes you don't have this sort of perfect, elegant, intuitive explanation of why something is true in math.
And of course, giving people problems to solve is a very great way of teaching as well. And that leads me to ask you about Rosalind, which you co-founded, I believe, while you were doing your PhD at UC San Diego. And I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what that very popular platform was built for and who used it.
It's funny. So I was a teaching assistant in mathematics courses at UC San Diego, and we would get, regardless of who was TAing which particular course, we would get the same courses every semester. The same courses are taught every semester, but also they'd be the same professors usually. They might change slightly, but the homework assignments were the exact same. And I think that really the first point at which I started thinking about Rosalind was I was a TA for a calculus course. I put together a solutions guide to the homework, not knowing that they were going to give the same homework in the next semester. And I wrote out detailed solutions for the students in the class after the homework was due so that they could see, here's sort of the cleanest way of going about solving these problems. And the students really liked it. But then the professor stepped in and said, you really shouldn't do that, because we're going to give this exact same homework assignment next semester, and that will spread around like wildfire, and that's what people will use to solve the homeworks. Not realizing, of course, that the solutions manuals to these textbooks are very easy to get. I mean, they take 5 seconds of Googling to get. So if you want the answers, they're not hard to find. But I thought of this being my job, that PhD students, a lot of people, if you're talking about, misconceptions, another misconception is that PhD students are students that they pay tuition or that they may take on debt. It's not quite like a medical school student. PhD students in the sciences are essentially apprentices. And in a discipline like mathematics, because you have people who may not have research funding for students, they make their apprenticeship salary, which is very meager, by serving as teaching assistants. And I just thought of this system where we're in a public school system. And yes, we go in and for an hour a week, we'll do a recitation where we work problems on the blackboard. But a lot of what we do, we're just graders. We're just sitting here grading exams and grading homework problems. And then I thought about how many students, especially given that this is like over multiple universities using the same textbook, grading the same problems by hand, semester in, semester out, over and over and over again, like year after year. And I thought, that's really strange. It's a very strange system of human labor that's extremely inefficient. And I had started being connected back to computational biology at that time through my research. And Pavel had a textbook at that time. And having gone through that textbook and seeing the algorithms that are fundamental to biology in terms of data analysis, especially with respect to DNA, going back to my example from previously of how do you assemble a genome from fragments? There are algorithms like some of the ones that Pavel has worked on, but across a lot of different areas of computational biology. Another example would be, say I have two genes, one from, say, our hemoglobin gene and a guinea pig's hemoglobin gene. That's representable as a string of amino acids, and you want to identify how they're similar. So how is it that you would compare them, given that In that case, the genes are relatively short, but you might have longer genes and don't want to do it by hand. You can do that for 2 genes, or you could do it for, say, 100 coronavirus genomes. The coronavirus genome is about 30,000 nucleotides long, and you could take 100 from different patients, and you want to line up all the letters and see where the differences are, because that can help you identify variants, for example. In both of those cases, you have extremely fundamental approaches that have been developed to solve these problems that are all about, here's 2 strings, or here's 100 strings being like words of letters, and we want to compare them and find out where they're similar and where they're different, and slide symbols around and so on to line them up in the way that makes the most sense, because that's going to infer how they've evolved. I thought it's the same sort of thing. You could have a lot of students learning about this, especially as the discipline is growing, and you have hundreds of universities that teach a course in this type of area, fundamental bioinformatics algorithms. And I was just thinking, does that mean that they're grading all the code by hand, or that everybody has produced all of their own auto graders for these tasks? And it makes a whole lot more sense to just build a central repository and say, for the neighbor joining algorithm, or for pairwise sequence alignment by Needleman-Wunsch, right? Like papers that people probably haven't heard of, but that have several thousand or tens of thousands of citations, because they're how biology gets done. Let's just have one auto grader that students can write some code, and they'll get a random data set from the website, and they can plug it into their code, and then take the output and put it in the website, and it gives them a check mark if they're done, and then they know they implemented that algorithm, and it takes any sort of human aspect out of this process and automates something that's going on all over the place. So that's what sort of the conception of Roslyn was. And in parallel, Pavel had a different student. He had 2 labs, one in St. Petersburg, Russia. He had a different student who had the same sort of idea, but building this autograder more locally and in terms of his own teaching. And so it grew from there. And our hope was maybe we could get like 10 universities on board. And we had no idea that it was going to wind up reaching, hundreds of thousands of people, because it wound up as an independent resource for learning. We figured out as we went along, we started to get people who were using this, just the public using it, and getting posted places, that it was outgrowing its original conception, and it was now just a place where people could learn about our field in an open and free way.
Yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. I was especially interested in hearing about the inspiration for sort of building something that would auto grade and kind of take the human element out of it, because the work that was being done in the first place wasn't very human in any case, right? This sort of this rote grading of things. Yes. And when you realize that actually this can be automated, that's better for everyone. I think a lot of people might hear, oh, we automated it, we took the human element out of it, that this is sort of like detracting from it or something like that. And not at all. This is actually making it much better for everyone.
Yes, the idea is that to free your teaching assistant's time to be spent on things that are more relevant, right? Like actually working with students and that type of thing.
Yeah, well, working directly with the students where the human element can be at play.
Certainly.
That reminds me, actually. So, I mean, we could talk. You've written about your teaching philosophy on your website, and you've also got Programming for Lovers, where you have a manifesto. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. Your teaching philosophy and the Programming for Lovers project.
So that's a project that is still sort of in progress. I'm planning a larger release of it on its own website. But the idea of this course would be that we tend to teach programming to people that, and I say we meaning the computer science community. Computer scientists tend to teach programming to other people that are going to be computer scientists. So hackers and people who like video games. And the examples that they tend to pull for teaching this will come from mathematics or computer science. And that's great if you're interested in those fields. I mean, had I had an exposure to something like that in high school, I might have gotten into computer science instead of mathematics. It wasn't even on my radar that you could use math for computers. But at the same time, you have a wealth of different processes that go on in science, whether it's some of the examples I've given from biology or something like building a gravity simulator, right, to simulate the motions of celestial bodies, that are great examples of how to program certain things, how to build a system and implement it in a programming language, and then visualize it and analyze it and so on. And so I've taught a course for 7 years now that I inherited from Carl Kingsford at CMU, where I've added a bunch of scientific examples, where the idea of teaching the programming course is, let's just present a scientific narrative, and that will lead us to a point at which we need a computer to answer some question. That's a scientific question. And then what skills do we need to answer that question? Well, let's get those skills, and then let's return and answer the question scientifically, and with using the computer. I think that's relatively unique. You don't have courses that are focused on learning computer science, but from the lens of a certain discipline. It's an area that's growing. And I think it's also growing in terms of, another part of programming education that's growing is in websites that are built to try and attract as many students as possible and to lower barriers to entry to learning how to code. And those projects are really, really good in some respects, in terms of knocking down barriers and convincing people that they can do something that maybe they thought was reserved for nerdy people at MIT and Carnegie Mellon and places like that, right? Where they're not so great is that often they're made with venture capital money, and they want to demonstrate to whomever that the project is successful, and there are metrics for this success. And often those metrics are based off of, how many active learners did you have, and exactly how many questions were they able to answer. And you boost those metrics by watering down content. So that's what I've seen when I've looked at a lot of places. Now, I'm not indicting every online education project, but I tend to find, and I find this through my own teaching at CMU, the number of students in the last 7 years, when I go into my class and ask who here has experience in programming, the number of hands that go up, it's practically like universal now, as opposed to it being a small minority of students 7 years ago. That's fantastic. However, you have students who have an exposure to a discipline, but they lack the rigor of and the challenge of that is inherent to the discipline. It is hard in a great way, and when you get it, it's a wonderful thing, right? All that is critical. And a lot of times they get very skin deep exposures to this field, and then they hit a point where they don't understand something, or they realize that it's hard, and then they often may internalize it, or they hit a dead end, and there's no sort of bridge to take them to truly this is a skill that people can learn. You do have to have some quantitative know-how, but that's also another skill, right? It's just critical that you get it at the right point in your educational timeline. But my idea for the course is to sort of combine a rigorous experience like what you would get with a classic introduction to computer science at a top-notch place, with some fun applications that are provided from science, and to try and find a way that's still accessible to beginners. So that's a project that I'm currently working on that I really want to see grow in the coming months, years, and that I think could have, as big an impact as some of the other stuff I've had the privilege of working on.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just such an interesting challenge even to articulate. It seems, and I've learned this, sort of doing research for this interview, even to articulate the kind of number of things that are intersecting that you're trying to bring together. You mentioned, for example, that I think it was the first time, just in your explanation, the first time in this interview that it came up, which is the term computer science. And in my introduction, I mentioned that you were in the Department of Computational Biology at Carnegie Mellon, but you're in the School of Computer Science. That Department of Computational Biology is in the School of Computer Science. And so I guess maybe probably one of the best ways to sort of work out all the things that are coming together in this. Could you talk a little bit about what someone would, how, what their program would be like as an undergraduate if they majored in computational biology?
Sure.
What courses would they take? What kind of people are you trying to get in through the I think it's called the pre-college program in computational biology? So if someone's listening and they're, let's say they don't know anything about all this, but it all sounds super interesting, what would you study if you did a major in computational biology
So
at CMU?
yes, we have, there's two programs here. We have a high school program. Our pre-college program in computational biology is open largely to rising seniors in high school. And we look really only for students who are strong quantitatively and who like science, especially biology, because there's a huge number of students out there who actually do like biology, want to study biology, and are just generally interested in science. And we have a sort of research project where we take students out on Pittsburgh's Three Rivers on a boat trip. It's about a 40-mile boat trip. And we do educational activities with them on the boat. And every so often we stop and sample water. Then they go into the lab, they isolate the DNA from that, their water samples. And then the purpose of the program is to analyze those water samples using algorithms that they themselves write. So the idea is there being this harmony between lab collection or field collection, laboratory experimental work, and computational data analysis. That is really what biology is all about. So to show students this in a 3-week intensive 8-hour-a-day summer program. And I've been amazed at how many students we've had that have been interested in this, because we didn't know, as sort of one of only a very small number of programs that teach computational biology to high school students globally. We didn't know if the students would show up, and then they really started showing up in droves, which has been fantastic. And so that's a program I love getting to work with. And I get to use my programming materials for students to get up to speed in programming. And then by the end of the 3 weeks, they code all these algorithms together. They're all like extremely strong in programming, which is something to be proud of too. And then they go off to different universities and so on. And we're hopeful that they take what they learn and continue to study biology. But if not, that's fine too. Our undergrad program is a 4-year major. So the School of Computer Science at CMU is a place that's essentially a top 3 place to study computer science historically, alongside MIT and Berkeley. MIT being the big name that has like the biggest household reach. But in terms of rankings and prestige and sort of the research accomplishments of professors and the quality of the education and so on, it's a top 3 institution. For 30 years, you could only study computer science. And over the past few years, we've seen a change to have now 4 majors. So now we have artificial intelligence, human-computer interaction, and computational biology as major options. And Comp Bio is actually the first non-computer science major. And the idea being that computer science is becoming extremely broad and influencing a lot of different parts of our lives. 30 years-ish ago, when they started a computer science major program, it was much more esoteric, right, in terms of what you could do with a computer science major. And now the demand for people working in this area is huge across every aspect of the economy, right? And so that exists at many places at the graduate level. But what's neat about CMU is we now have multiple majors at the undergrad level. So if you were a comp bio major, for example, you're still a computer science student, which means you still take what I call a brain car wash of mathematics and computer science core courses. But then you also take some biology foundational courses where you start to realize like what bio is, sort of thing. And you have a computational biology core of coursework too. So you have a lab course that's based off of heavy data analysis. I teach the first course in the major called Great Ideas in Computational Biology that actually won a teaching award this spring at CMU, which I was very happy about. That shows students what are the big ideas that have made biology a data discipline. And then students take advanced coursework that kind of brings them closer to what real companies and real researchers are working on and the methods that are at the frontier of the field when they're in their later couple of years.
You mentioned biology and data, and that reminds me of a line I wrote down from a video that I watched yesterday, where you say biology is now fundamentally a data science. And when you talk about sort of introducing students to what biology really is, and it's not, what was a friend of mine who was a biologist once complained about how people often had a kind of fried egg view of a cell. It's like a circle with a circle in it. And, it is, as you mentioned before, it is easy to get very sarcastic about these kinds of things, but,
because it's been flattened against a plate.
Right. Because
it doesn't necessarily reflect its reality.
Yeah, because of microscope technology and the way that worked and things like that, and then you had to put light underneath it and stuff like that. But it's interesting. And of course, I know you brought that up on purpose to say that the way we view things depends on the technology that we use, and the images we have in our heads depends on the technology we use. But when it comes to the complexity of what biology is, I just wanted to read, and I wanted to move on now to talking about your book, specifically Biological Modeling: A Short Tour. There's this great passage at the beginning that I'm just going to read, which I love, which you say, and I'm quoting here: "You may feel like a single coherent being, but you are just a skin-covered bag of trillions of cells, about half of which are bacteria that act largely independently. These cells are full of proteins, complex macromolecules that perform nearly every cellular function. If a protein could move in a straight line, then it would move at 20 kilometers per hour or faster, meaning that the protein would cover a distance 1 billion times its length every second, analogous to a car traveling 20 billion kilometers per hour. However, the cytoplasm filling the cell is so densely packed with water molecules that the protein pings off them, frequently changing direction." End quote. And I just love how that it sort of grounds things in ourselves. But when it really brought home to me reading it was like just really how biology is a data science.
It's a data science. And I hope it's clear that with the quote like that, I don't know, that's me trying to get into somebody else's head the wonder of biology from the perspective of, I thought it was X and it's actually Y, and look at, like, there's a lot going on in what you just read, right, to try and densely grab somebody's attention, because all that to me is just amazing. Like, that you have a system that's so complex with things just moving unbelievably fast with all this energy and bouncing off of each other, and that somehow the whole symphony makes sense because of all these random interactions is amazing. Like, our conversation is ultimately dependent upon all of that. And I mean, there's other things lurking in that, like about half of our cells aren't even ours, they're bacteria. They're just hanging out. Sometimes they are helping us symbiotically. But also what I think is a grand challenge of biology, which is you have a reductive model, reductive models, but then how do we take a holistic view of those reductive models? How do they connect? How is it that all these random interactions of particles drive what goes on in the cell, but then the interactions of cells, often behaving independently, producing large-scale behaviors? That is something that is pretty much open. And we hint on show in one of the chapters, we hint on trying to connect completely understanding a system on the level of its machinery, and then being able to infer things about that system because we built a model that was good enough to be able to step back from it on a higher view and understand it. And that has been done in the biggest, probably the most landmark example that I could think of this being done would be taking a very simplistic bacterium and building a model of each of its processes independently, and then connecting those processes according to what's known biologically. And then you've got everything simulated on a computer. So you click run and let the computer simulation work. So this is about 10 years old that they did this for a simple bacterium. They still haven't taken that work and extended it to E. coli. So what was partly cool about that model is that they were able to look at the model and see what happened at the end, measure the concentrations of particles over time and look at different processes as they interacted, and the system just sort of worked. And then they were able to reach biological hypotheses that weren't actually experimentally validated or known at that time. Because here's what the model told us. Maybe that's nonsense. Maybe it's true. If the model is great, then it's true. But it might just be a figment of the model not being perfect. But there are actually examples of the model made predictions that people went into a lab and validated. And I think, to me, that's the big, like one enormous frontier of biology, is doing that for increasingly complex organisms. Let's do it for a complicated bacterium next. Let's have some sort of colony of bacteria that we simulate. And then let's get ever and ever more complex in terms of what it is that we can model. Can we model a human cell? We're not there yet. We can model human cell systems, very simplistic representations of it, but no one has built, I don't think, a complete working model of a human cell. So then what about an organ, right? That's based off of cells. And I think my point with that is that at what point are we then heading towards replicating human intelligence on a computer? It's not going to be anytime soon, so there's no reason to be concerned. But you can see how incremental changes to this, if you go back 50 years, no one would have thought you could completely replicate a bacterium on a computer. And yet that's been done.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there that that we could do probably three or four podcasts just on that one set of things you just talked about. But I want to see if I can do my best to try and focus in on a specific example of biological modeling based on something that you brought up, which is the squishing of something between two glass slides and then using it in a microscope. So it used to be that to observe the world we used our eyes. We more or less didn't have much. I mean, we used our other senses as well and things like that. But then people, with respect to specifically to biology, people develop microscopes and they're all of a sudden like, oh my God, look at all this stuff that's going on at this smaller scale. Now we can see things at that smaller scale. And then the scales at which we could view things got smaller and smaller and smaller with things like electron microscopes and things like that. But typically, just like you were talking about squishing, you squish that poor cell between the glass slides and it goes flat. Often this meant changing the contents of the cell by coloring it, or just it has to be a dead cell in order for you to view it certain ways. But with basically biology becoming a data science and being able to do computational modeling, one thing you can do is basically train programs to look at the surface of living cell and infer what's going on with all the organelles and other kinds of things inside. If I'm probably getting that wrong, but there's some version of this, right? That so you don't actually have to kill the cell, but you can, based on millions of examples, you can sort of infer what's going on by observing the surface and using basically pattern matching.
Right. I would say that that's a little beyond my own expertise, but it's this type of thing that colleagues have worked on. One notable example would be a former PhD student in our department worked on, or a couple of former PhD students, worked on, they were at Allen Cell Institute, and they were working on what are called bright field images of cells. So they're grayscale. The cells, you don't have to kill them, that's nice, but they're low res images of the cells. And it's you would think of this as a simplistic form of microscopy, but it has the benefit that the cells are living and you can visualize them interacting. But that was in contrast to much more cutting edge approaches like in fluorescent microscopy. That's another thing that I don't think maybe many people would appreciate, that there's still extreme advances going on in terms of microscopy, right? But what these two folks did, and a few others worked on, was taking the bright field images and saying, maybe, the human eye can only see so much, and that there actually is something that can be inferred from that on a deeper level. And so let's train a computer, right? In other words, build an algorithm. That sounds more AI than it really is, but build an algorithm that is able to infer a lot of patterns from that and then predict what they think that computer thinks, or the algorithm thinks that the fluorescent microscopy versions of those images would be. And I remember they showed that to our students at an industry event, and I couldn't believe it. And apparently they said that it's the same sort of reaction that they've they've had anytime they show biologists, because it's just a mind-blowing thing to look at, that you can take one form of data that seems so primitive and infer something that's much, much higher resolution from that. And that's an amazing thing too.
Yeah, and it's reminding me. I don't know if we want to go down this path, but one thing that was so interesting for me, sort of looking at the book and stuff, is seeing the parallel language to physics, concepts like coarse graining and emergence and things like that, which aren't metaphors, given the way that biology is being done now. If I understand it correctly, like it's kind of like the same kind of thing.
Yes, exactly.
And just before we go on, maybe to move on to the last part of the interview, where we talk about the sort of like, how you pulled off these kinds of projects and things like that, and specifically the bigger project that this book came out of. At the very beginning of the book, you do have this great example where you bring computation, computer science and biology together with the example of Alan Turing and the zebra's spots. Or stripes, pardon me. So I was wondering if you could just maybe talk just tell that story just briefly, so people can see that connection.
Sure. So Alan Turing, I mean, now once they've made a movie about him starring Benedict Cumberbatch, he's entered the public eye. But so many people have now heard of Alan Turing, but he's famous for a couple of things. He was a famed code breaker who broke Nazi codes working at Bletchley Park in England during World War II. And he also conceptualized what a computer is on a very basic level. He said, it's the same sort of thing that we're talking about in terms of building models. He said, essentially, can I build a model of what a computer might be and what abilities it might have that's as simply represented as we can come up with? And so his theoretical computer, there's no implementation of that computer needed. The idea is just to theorize it. His computer says you have a reader. So the reader is like a camera of sorts that can read out symbols on a tape. The tape is as long as you like it to be, but the tape only has symbols printed on it. Each cell of the tape has a single symbol. In a classical formulation, you have either a 0, a 1, or a blank printed on a symbol, on a cell. So, for example, you can have a string of zeros and ones that might represent a longer number. And so Turing was able to show that you could do an enormous number of things with a computer whose only abilities are to read something off of the tape. And based off of the current state it's in, the machine has a finite number of internal states. So if I'm in state 37 and I see a 0, I'm going to change the 0 to a 1. I'm going to move one cell to the right, and I'm going to enter state 43. So that's always the steps it's going to take. If it's in state 37 and it sees that 0 on the tape, it's always going to do that. So it doesn't have any flexibility. That conception of a computer from the 30s is as powerful as the most powerful supercomputer on the planet today. And there's a hypothesis that any computer that we could ever come up with could be represented, anything it does could be represented by some set of instructions on what's called a Turing machine. So Turing's famous for this because that's an amazing development. It's in the 30s, right, that he essentially lays these foundations of computer science upon which no one has advanced since that time, even though we have wonderful devices. But he's also famous for one paper in biochemistry where he proposed that the reason why zebras have stripes might be as the result of a relatively simple system in which two different types of particles are interacting according to some rules. And because of those rules, you see a segregation. Although it's not perfect, if you zoom in on a zebra, you won't see perfect black regions and perfect white regions. It's the same for a fish. For example, you zoom in on a fish that has stripes, and they're not perfect. You have a light blue stripe and a dark blue stripe. Not every pigment cell is light blue or dark blue in those stripes. But you would see some segregation that when, again, thinking from the perspective of zooming out, from a holistic perspective of seeing a photo of the fish or a photo of the zebra, you see stripes. And that was his one paper in this area. And in his honor, patterns like what we see on the zebra or what we see on zebrafish or pufferfish are called Turing patterns, based off of this hypothesis that it's based off of actually a very small, simple set of rules, the same sort of thing that Turing worked on with respect to computers. And this has been validated in zebrafish, that the pigments of zebrafish, the pigment cells form stripes because of a simple set of rules that are similar to what Turing was talking about. And so the purpose of that sort of introduction to the book is to explain what a sample Turing pattern system might be. What are the rules that dictate two types of particles interacting almost in kind of a predator-prey relationship? And then to be able to zoom out from that and see whether or not patterns are indeed forming as a result.
You captured a really great and fascinating ambiguity there in biology. But when you talked about the reason zebras have stripes, because from this sort of particle-based modeling explanation, like the reason is because this is how these particles that operate according to these rules and are in various states interact under certain conditions. That's the reason that there are stripes. But the reason that the sort of like this sort of, I guess, this sort of evolutionary reason that zebras have stripes, we don't really have a sort of complete answer to that yet, right? I think you say in your book that people are pretty sure it's because it helps keep flies off the zebras, but it captures that difference of the totally different and that type of analysis you do given the scale at which you're looking at the phenomena.
But then apparently other researchers said, well, you don't need stripes to keep the flies off. As long as it were some type of black and white pattern, you could use a checkerboard. So why did they evolve the stripes versus some other way of organizing the skin and alternating patterns of light and dark? It's not clear.
Yeah, and I just love that example because it goes like even with all the like amazing stuff we can do nowadays, not just like with the specific machines, but with the sort of concepts like the relatively recent in human history concept of a Turing machine. I mean, the things we can do at all these different scales, but there's still these like really big problems to solve and answers to find, which is what makes it such a fascinating field. And so the book came out of a larger project called Biological Modeling, if I understand it correctly, which is a free course. And well, of course, everything that I've been talking about, there'll be links to in the transcript for this interview. But I was wondering if you could just talk about that from the bracketing the kind of science of it, just from the project level. And you've set up a number of successful projects like or worked on and with other people like Rosalind and the Coursera course and things like that. But you started this, I believe, with a Kickstarter campaign.
Well, no, it's not quite. So it's okay. The project itself, the course is funded by National Institutes of Health grant.
Okay.
And so we've worked, to make a completely free and open online course for anyone to take a look at and learn from. And I've worked on that with, several students, undergraduate and master's students at Carnegie Mellon in computational biology who helped me build out parts of the course. And then the idea was, well, we've built this pretty gargantuan thing. The course is a collection of text modules. And then the idea of the course is that every so often you'll hit a point where we need to build the model and then look at it. And so every time that happens, we have a link to a tutorial that shows you how to use modeling software to produce the model. And then we come back to the main text and analyze it. So all of the main text itself was like 100,000 words. And then the tutorials, I think, are actually longer if you add them all up. So I realized we had quite a lot there. And so I funded a textbook project coming from the course, packaging the main text of the course into a way that would be engaging in a PDF form or a printed form. And we funded that by Kickstarter and then Indiegogo starting in December. And we're finalizing publication of it currently.
And just for those listening who are interested in setting up projects like this, maybe not everybody's going to get National Institutes of Health grants to begin their projects, but there are sort of people who are interested in sort of Indiegogo and Kickstarter. And I was very curious actually about what happened that you used both Kickstarter and Indiegogo.
This was just doing some due diligence on best practices for campaigns, and Kickstarter has a timeline. And what I would suggest to anybody is find these resources and follow what they say, because I think that they're backed in research and results, and they make sense. So, for example, don't have a campaign that lasts 6 years. You might think you're maximize your revenue that way or whatever, but it doesn't. It's nice to have very clearly defined projects and relatively short timelines in terms of funding and that type of thing. But because Kickstarter's time frame ends after a set period of time where everything is all or nothing in terms of the funding, after that period of time, you can still, if you're still in the process of making something, you can have the exact same project on Indiegogo. There's a relationship between the two platforms, and they will simply port over all of your information about the project, including how much you raised, and they cross-link. And so it's essentially one project on two different platforms.
Okay, I thought I saw that they actually had maybe this happened years ago, but that they actually had established a connection with each other rather than acting as total competitors, which is what I had naively viewed them as. That's really fascinating. And as you say, that they're sort of using their experience and their data and theory to kind of like help people actually genuinely complete their projects and set them up properly. And that, Kickstarter might be good for one part and then Indiegogo might be better for another part. That's really, really fascinating. And specifically when it came to writing the book, so you used our upload feature on LeanPub to get it onto the site and onto the platform. It's a very well-made book, and it has all sorts of cool features like these laptop icons in the margins that people can click on that take them to particular, appropriate parts of the course or other places online. And I was wondering if you could just talk about what, for any authors listening or would-be authors listening, what tool did you use or tools did you use to create the ebook?
Oh, so because I'm a mathematician, I use LaTeX. Which is typesetting software that is sort of very, very much used by mathematicians, often with all the defaults on. So you can tell a document that mathematicians produce because it's in the same sort of computer modern Donald Knuth fonts. But LaTeX is a wonderful system, and it has a ton of packages and add-ons and so on. Where you can do quite a lot of things, especially if you're not like an artsy person like me. I would have a hard time going from the HTML of our course and converting that into like Adobe Illustrator or something like that. But I'm technical, so I can handle sort of the codey aspects of LaTeX. And then there's a package called Memoir that someone produced as an add-on for LaTeX with a 650-page PDF documenting everything that you can do with it. And it's really nice for longer documents and customizable fonts and things like that. So that's something that I used for this book. And it means that it's relatively powerful, right? So yeah, if you want to have calls to the margin of hyperlinks to our website that are these laptop icons, it's really winds up just being one command that you write all the code for behind the scenes and that type of thing. And
so that means you were writing in plain text files and things like that.
Yes, it's essentially a .txt.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for sharing that. It's always fascinating. One of the interesting things about the fact that LeanPub sort of attracts so many people who are technically minded is that they often have very kind of like sophisticated and somewhat bespoke sort of methods for making their own books. Mm-hmm. If they're not using one of our own book writing processes, and it's always so interesting to hear about them. The last question
Sure.
that I always like to ask on the podcast, if the guest is using LeanPub as a platform, is if there was one magical feature that we could build for you, or if there was one terribly awful thing that had you shouting at the screen every time you went to our website that we could fix for you, can you think of anything that you would ask us to do?
I don't know if I would. That's a good question. I wasn't expecting it, but I'd probably need more time to think.
Okay, well, no problem. Actually, you're probably not going to be surprised that half the time that's what people say. But yeah, please get in touch anytime if you have with me if you ever have it. Think of anything. One of the reasons, insofar as LeanPub is the platform that it is, it's because we've asked this question of many authors over the years and getting their feedback about this would be great or that would be great or this is awful or you don't need that and things like that. But that being said, well, Philip, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to do this interview. As I'm sure people listening, there were so many things that we could have talked about for so much longer. But if you're interested in learning more about all of this, Philip's been a part of and produced himself so much really interesting content that's available, much of it for free, that you can find if you listen to what we were talking about here, or if you go to the links in the transcript that we'll publish on the website. where you can find, the sources of all the things that we talked about. So thank you very much, Phillip, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you, and it's great to be here.
Thanks. And as always, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the Front Matter podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review it wherever you found it. And if you'd like to be a Lean Pub author yourself, please check out our website at leanpub.com. Thanks.